In the farthest reaches of the world, where the snow seemed endless and the winds howled like wolves under the pale light of the moon, there lived an old man named Elliot. His cabin, small and weathered, stood on the edge of a frozen sea, where the ice stretched out in all directions, meeting the horizon in a seamless expanse of white. Elliot's home was far from any city, far from the noise and chaos of the world. The only sounds that filled the air were the whispers of the wind and the quiet murmur of the sea as it froze in winter's grip. Elliot had lived alone for many years, choosing solitude over company, peace over noise. He was a quiet man, with hands weathered by time, his hair long and white like the snow that blanketed the world outside. His life was simple. He rose early each day, cut firewood, tended to his small garden, and made sure his cabin stayed warm against the bitter cold of the northern winters. He had no need for much more. His world was the silence of nature, the companionship of the birds that flew by in the summer, and the occasional fox that wandered into his yard. But even in his isolation, there was something inside him that yearned for a connection, something he had long buried in the corners of his heart. Elliot had once known the warmth of a family, a wife and children who had shared the winters with him, the warmth of laughter by the fire, and the joy of sharing meals. But time had taken them from him. First his wife, taken by an illness that came quietly in the night. Then his children who had grown up and moved away, chasing their dreams in cities far from the cold wilderness. And so, Elliot had stayed, his heart quieting with the years, as the memories of laughter and joy faded into the background of his life. The loneliness didn't always bother him. Most days it was simply part of the rhythm of his life. The winter nights were long, but they weren't oppressive. They were just another part of the world he had come to know so well. He had made peace with the silence, finding comfort in the crackling fire and the snowflakes that danced outside his window. He had come to understand that solitude was not something to be feared. It was a place where he could listen to the world, reflect on the years gone by, and find solace in the steady rhythm of his own heart. But there were moments in the stillness of the night when Elliot would look out at the vast, frozen landscape and feel an ache in his chest. It was a deep, unspoken longing, something he had learned to ignore, but that still lingered in the corners of his soul. He wasn't sure what it was. He wasn't sure if it was the memory of the family he had lost, or the understanding that, no matter how beautiful the land was, it would always be empty without someone to share it with. He had never expected life to be perfect. He had never expected the world to be kind or easy. He had simply chosen to live in peace with what he had. But deep down, Elliot knew that there was a part of him that still wanted something more. That night, as the winds howled outside and the snow piled up against the windows, Elliot felt that old familiar ache again. But he didn't push it away. Instead, he sat by the fire, letting the quiet comfort of the flames fill the space around him. For tonight, he would not think of the past or of the years that had passed in silence. Tonight, he would simply listen to the wind, to the world around him, and wait for whatever might come next. Elliot had always been attuned to the quiet rhythms of the wilderness, the howl of the wind, the creaking of the trees in the night, the distant calls of the wolves. These were the sounds that marked the passage of time in his life. But that night, as the wind whipped through the trees and the snow fell in thick, swirling drifts, Elliot was disturbed by something different, something out of place. It was a cry, a faint, muffled cry that seemed to pierce through the howling wind in the quiet of the night. At first, Elliot thought it was a trick of the wind, a branch creaking or an animal call in the distance. But the sound came again, this time louder, more urgent. It was the cry of something in distress, something in pain. His heart quickened, and a strange sense of unease settled over him. Elliot stood up from his rocking chair by the fire and walked to the window. The moon was hidden behind a thick cloud cover, and the world outside was a blur of white. The snowstorm had intensified, and the landscape was barely visible beyond the cabin's walls. But still, Elliot strained his ears, listening intently. There it was again, a soft, almost desperate cry carried by the wind from the direction of the frozen sea. His heart pounded in his chest as he threw on his thick coat and woolen scarf. The cabin's warmth seemed to retreat as soon as he opened the door, the icy wind cutting through him like a blade. The snow was heavy now, falling in thick sheets, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. But Elliot didn't hesitate. The cry had sounded like an animal in need, and he couldn't ignore it. Stepping into the storm, Elliot trudged through the snow, his boots sinking with each step. The wind bit at his face and the cold gnawed at his bones, but Elliot pushed on, following the sound of the cry. It was faint, but it seemed to grow louder with every step he took, guiding him through the snowdrifts toward the edge of the frozen sea. And then, through the swirling snow, he saw it, a large shape lying on the ice near the shore. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as he realized what it was. It was a polar bear, its white fur blending into the snow, but its massive body twisted at an unnatural angle. The bear's eyes were wide with pain, and it let out a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down Elliot's spine. It was weak, far too weak to be out here alone, in the freezing cold. Elliot approached cautiously, his heart racing as he took in the sight of the injured creature. The bear's body was battered, its fur matted with dirt and blood. One of its legs was twisted at an odd angle, and its breathing was shallow, each exhale more labored than the last. The polar bear's gaze flickered toward him, its eyes filled with fear, but also something else. Desperation, perhaps, or a plea for help. Elliot knew he had to act quickly. There was no time to waste. The bear was on the verge of collapse, and if he didn't get it inside soon, it might not survive the night. He approached the bear slowly, speaking in a calm, steady voice, trying to soothe it. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice soft but firm. "I won't hurt you." The polar bear flinched as he drew closer, its body trembling with pain and exhaustion. But Elliot continued to speak, moving slowly and carefully, his heart aching for the injured animal. He could see the fear in the bear's eyes, the raw vulnerability of a creature that had wandered too far from home, alone and broken. Elliot reached out with a steady hand, gently brushing the bear's head with his fingers. The touch was tentative at first, but as he continued, the bear seemed to relax, its breathing slowing ever so slightly. Elliot's heart swelled with compassion. He had dealt with many animals in his life. He had hunted, trapped, and tended to many creatures over the years. But this bear was different. This bear was in need of help, not harm. It was a creature of the wild, lost and broken, and Elliot knew in that moment that he could not leave it to die alone on the ice. Carefully, Elliot moved to the side of the bear and positioned himself to help lift its massive form. The bear let out a pained grunt as he carefully supported it, his hands trembling with the weight of the task. He could feel the heat of the bear's body against his own, and despite the cold, the warmth between them seemed to create a connection. He wasn't sure how long he would be able to carry the bear, but he knew he couldn't leave it there, alone in the storm. With a determined breath, Elliot began the slow, grueling trek back toward the cabin, the bear leaning heavily against him. The wind howled, the snow fell thick and fast, but Elliot didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. The polar bear's survival depended on him, and he would do whatever it took to get the animal to safety. Each step felt heavier than the last, but Elliot pushed on, his mind focused only on the creature in his arms. The storm was relentless, but his heart was steady. He was not alone in this moment. The bear, though broken and in pain, was with him, and together they would survive the storm. The wind seemed to howl even louder as Elliot struggled to make his way back to the cabin, the heavy polar bear's form leaning against him with every step. The snow swirled around them, blurring the world into a cold, featureless white. Despite the bear's weight and the biting cold, Elliot didn't stop. He couldn't. The polar bear's life was in his hands now, and no matter how difficult the journey, he couldn't leave it to die alone in the storm. The icy wind cut through his coat, chilling him to the bone, but he kept going, driven by a sense of urgency. He could feel the bear's shallow breast against his side, the warmth of its body a stark contrast to the freezing night around them. Every so often, the bear would let out a low, pained groan, but Elliot would whisper softly to it, hoping to reassure the creature with his presence. "You're going to be okay. We're almost there." he murmured, even though he wasn't sure if the bear could hear him or understand. But somehow he believed the bear knew his intentions. By the time they reached the cabin, Elliot was exhausted, his legs shaking from the effort of carrying the bear through the deep snow. He stumbled through the door, the warmth of the cabin's fire a stark contrast to the freezing night. The polar bear's massive form was heavy in his arms, but Elliot gently laid it on the floor near the hearth, taking a moment to catch his breath before he began to assess the bear's injuries. Elliot's heart ached as he examined the bear's leg. It was twisted unnaturally, likely broken, and there were deep gashes along its side where the animal had been scraped or cut. Blood had matted its fur in several places, and the bear's breathing was shallow, each inhale a struggle. But despite the severity of its injuries, there was still life in the bear, still the spark of survival. It wasn't too late. "Hang in there, friend," Elliot whispered as he gathered blankets and furs to make the bear as comfortable as possible. He worked quickly, knowing that the bear's life depended on him. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime tending to others, whether it was animals or the land itself. Though the polar bear was a creature of the wild, in this moment, it was as vulnerable as a newborn. With trembling hands, Elliot carefully began to clean the bear's wounds. He used a warm cloth to wipe away the dirt and blood, the bear's skin flinching at the touch. But Elliot remained gentle, speaking in low, soothing tones to keep the bear calm. "You're safe now. I'm here. I won't leave you." The process was slow and meticulous. Every movement mattered. Every action needed to be precise. Elliot had no experience treating a bear's injuries, but he had learned much over the years. How to tend to wounds, how to soothe pain, how to help an animal survive when it seemed beyond hope. And that was what he did now. He worked through the night, his hands steady even though exhaustion tugged at him. By the time the first rays of morning light began to filter through the cabin's small window, Elliot had managed to stabilize the polar bear. The bear's breathing had slowed, becoming deeper and more even, though it was still far from fully recovered. Elliot had made a makeshift splint for the bear's leg, using some of the wood he had on hand, and he had covered the creature with layers of blankets to keep it warm. As he sat by the fire, watching over the bear, Elliot felt a deep sense of peace. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the world outside had quieted, the storm passing over. The only sound in the cabin was the steady breathing of the bear and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Elliot's body ached with fatigue, but he didn't mind. The bear was safe, and that was all that mattered. For the first time in many years, he felt a deep sense of purpose, like he had done something that truly mattered. In the days that followed, Elliot continued to care for the bear. He fed it small amounts of food, helped it drink water, and kept the fire stoked so that the cabin remained warm. The bear's condition slowly began to improve, though it was clear that it would take time for it to fully recover. Elliot had to be patient, something he had learned over the years of living alone in the wilderness. But even in the quiet moments, when the bear rested and Elliot sat beside it, watching the firelight dance, he felt a connection growing between them, a bond that neither of them had expected. At night, the bear would shift in its sleep, its large body moving cautiously, as if testing its strength. Sometimes Elliot would speak softly to it, sharing stories of his life in the quiet of the forest. The bear seemed to listen, its eyes half-lidded, as if it could sense the kindness in the old man's voice. "Before the storm came, I was alone, just like you," Elliot said one evening as the fire crackled. "But now it's different. I've got company." He smiled softly at the bear, who seemed to rest more comfortably at his words. Elliot wasn't sure if the bear understood him, but in some strange way he felt as though the bear knew. They were both creatures of the wild, bound by the harshness of the world outside, yet somehow they had found a rare moment of peace in each other's presence. And though the future remained uncertain, Elliot knew one thing for sure: he had done the right thing. The polar bear had come into his life at a time when he least expected it, but it had given him something invaluable: purpose, connection, and the chance to care for another being once again. The days passed slowly in the warmth of the cabin. Elliot tended to the polar bear with a quiet dedication, each action performed with the utmost care. As the storm outside subsided and the days grew longer, Elliot began to notice the subtle changes in the bear. Its breathing was more steady, its eyes clearer, and it was growing stronger by the day. The faint tremors that had once overtaken its massive form had lessened, and there was an undeniable shift in the bear's presence. The creature, though still weak and fragile, was no longer the same fearful, injured animal that had collapsed at the edge of the frozen sea. Each day, the bear seemed to trust Elliot more. It had begun to show signs of curiosity, lifting its head to watch him as he worked by the fire, or slowly dragging itself to the window to gaze out at the snow-covered wilderness. Elliot would sit by the bear, speaking softly to it, and sometimes, even though the bear couldn't understand his words, it would seem to respond. Its eyes locked on him with an expression of quiet recognition. Elliot smiled at these moments. He had never thought of himself as a man who was particularly skilled with animals. His life had been one of solitude, of quiet reflection and hard work. But there was something about this bear that called to him. It was as if the bond between them was being built on something deeper than words, something more instinctive, something that had been forged in the quiet of the storm and the care of the old man. One afternoon, after Elliot had finished preparing a meal of fish and potatoes, he placed the food before the bear. It had been several days since the bear had eaten properly, and though Elliot had been careful to offer small portions at first, he could see that the polar bear was ready for more. At first, the bear hesitated. Its massive paw hovered over the food, and for a moment, it seemed as if it might pull back, retreating into itself. But then, after a long pause, the bear leaned forward, its sharp teeth taking a small bite. Elliot watched with quiet satisfaction as the bear ate, the rhythmic sounds of chewing filling the otherwise still cabin. "You're doing well," Elliot said softly, leaning back in his chair. "Better than I thought, that's for sure." The bear looked up at him, its eyes soft but bright, and for the first time, Elliot thought he saw something akin to gratitude in those eyes. It was subtle, fleeting, but it was there. For the next few days, the polar bear continued to regain its strength, and with each passing moment, its trust in Elliot seemed to grow. It would follow him from room to room, its large paws moving with a newfound confidence, though it still limped slightly on its injured leg. The bear no longer recoiled from Elliot's touch, but welcomed it, nudging him with its nose or resting its head gently on his lap while he sat by the fire. It was a silent communication, one that spoke volumes. Elliot began to feel an emotional shift as well. In caring for this polar bear, he had found a new purpose, a connection he hadn't known he needed. The loneliness he had felt for so many years was beginning to ease, replaced by something quieter and more profound. There was a deep satisfaction in knowing that he was helping this creature heal, not just physically, but emotionally as well. And in return, the bear, with its quiet presence, was helping him heal too. As the days wore on, the polar bear began to move with more ease. It would slowly limp to the door, gazing out at the landscape beyond, and sometimes when the sun hung low in the sky, Elliot would sit beside the bear and watch as it stared at the horizon, a wild longing in its eyes. Elliot knew what it meant. The bear was recovering, growing stronger, and though it was now in a safe place, it longed for the wilderness, for the freedom it had lost when it had been injured. Elliot knew that it was inevitable. The bear, like all creatures of the wild, would need to return to the world it belonged to. But for now, Elliot was content. The bond between them had been forged in the quiet of those first days, through care, patience, and trust, and that bond would never fade, no matter where the bear went. At night, when the fire burned low and the wind outside howled through the trees, Elliot would sit in his rocking chair, his hands folded in his lap, watching the polar bear rest beside him. The bear would settle down on its bed of furs, its body still, but its eyes never far from Elliot. In those moments, the two of them were content in the silence of the cabin, connected in a way that words could never capture. Elliot felt a profound peace as he sat there, feeling the steady presence of the polar bear beside him. He realized in that quiet moment that the love he had given this animal was not one-sided. The bear had come into his life when he had needed it most, and together they had forged something beautiful, something that would live on long after the bear returned to the wild. As the days passed, Elliot's bond with the bear only deepened. He cared for the bear not out of obligation, but because his heart told him that this was what he was meant to do. And in return, the polar bear showed him that even in the harshest corners of the world, there was room for connection, for love, and for the kind of companionship that didn't need words to be understood. As the days stretched into weeks, the harsh winter outside began to wane. The cold winds, while still fierce, started to soften, and the snow gradually gave way to the early signs of spring. Though the season was changing, the cabin remained a warm refuge for Elliot and the polar bear. The fire burned steadily, and the bear's breathing, once shallow and ragged, had become deep and steady. Its once feeble form had gained strength, and the deep, vulnerable gaze it had carried upon their first meeting had softened into something more akin to trust, a trust that Elliot could feel in his own bones. Yet despite the peace of their quiet life together, something had shifted. Elliot had seen it in the bear's eyes, the way it would stare out of the cabin window, its gaze fixed on the horizon, as if yearning for something beyond the warmth of the hearth. It was no longer the weak creature that had stumbled into his life, but a strong, independent animal, one that carried the wildness of the tundra in its soul. The more time passed, the more Elliot realized that the polar bear, his companion, his patient, was starting to long for the wilderness it came from. One afternoon, as Elliot was preparing a meal by the fire, he heard a soft grunt behind him. He turned to see the polar bear standing at the window, its large form silhouetted against the dimming light outside. The bear was looking out into the snow-covered landscape, its eyes distant. Elliot could sense the restlessness in the air. The animal was no longer content within the walls of the cabin. It was healing, yes, but it was also aching to be free. Elliot walked over to the window and stood beside the bear, looking out at the vast, open landscape. The snow had begun to melt, and patches of earth were visible once again. In the distance, the sea stretched out into the horizon, shimmering faintly under the setting sun. The polar bear turned its gaze toward Elliot, and in that brief moment, their eyes met. There was no fear in the bear's eyes now, no pain, just a quiet understanding. "I know," Elliot whispered, his voice soft with the weight of what he was about to say. "I know you need to go." The polar bear let out a low growl, its gaze lingering on the wild world outside. It seemed to understand that Elliot knew what was in its heart, the yearning for the frozen land, the endless snow. The bond between them had deepened, and yet Elliot knew that the bear was not meant to stay forever. It was a creature of the wild, of the icy north. Elliot's cabin had been a temporary refuge, a shelter from the storm, but the time was coming when the bear would need to return to its rightful place. The thought of letting the bear go, of opening the door and watching it disappear into the wild, weighed heavily on Elliot's heart. He had cared for the bear, healed its wounds, given it comfort and warmth. In many ways, the bear had become a part of him, a part of his world that he didn't know he needed. The loneliness that had haunted him for so many years had been eased by the presence of the polar bear. But as the days passed and the bear regained its strength, Elliot knew that holding on was not an option. The love he had given the bear, the care and protection, had been an act of kindness, a kindness that required him to let go. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Elliot watched the bear resting on its bed of furs, its eyes closed in a peaceful sleep. He ran his fingers over the firewood, his mind heavy with thoughts. He had never been one to shy away from difficult decisions, but this one, the decision to let the bear return to the wild, felt different. "I don't want to say goodbye," Elliot muttered, though the words seemed hollow in the quiet of the cabin. "But I know you belong to the world out there. You've healed and the wild is calling you." The polar bear stirred at his words, its eyes opening slowly. It looked at Elliot for a long time, its gaze steady, as if weighing his words. The bond between them was clear. The old man had cared for it, and the bear had repaid him with trust and affection. But now the time had come for the polar bear to follow its natural instincts. It wasn't the man's love that it needed anymore. It was the call of the ice and snow, the wide open spaces of the wild, where it could roam free. Elliot sat back, his heart aching as he watched the bear. He had always known that this moment would come, that the bear's journey would not end with him, but the reality of it, of saying goodbye to the creature that had become his companion, was a weight he hadn't prepared for. He stood slowly, making his way to the door. The bear looked at him, its large, intelligent eyes following his every movement. Elliot hesitated for a moment before he opened the door, letting the cold night air rush into the cabin. The wind howled outside, the snow swirling in every direction. It was still winter, still harsh, but the promise of spring was in the air. The polar bear stood, its large form moving toward the door. It took a few tentative steps, then paused, looking back at Elliot one last time. Elliot knelt down beside the bear, his hands resting on its massive head, his fingers gently stroking its fur. "I'll never forget you," Elliot whispered. "You've given me more than I could have asked for. Go, be free." With a final soft grunt, the polar bear turned and stepped into the snow. Its massive paws left prints in the snow, and as it walked away, it didn't look back. Elliot stood at the door, watching the bear disappear into the night, its silhouette slowly vanishing into the swirling storm. And though Elliot's heart ached with the weight of the farewell, he knew that he had done the right thing. He had given the bear what it needed most: freedom, the chance to return to the wild. He had loved it in the only way he knew how, with care, with kindness, and with the ability to let go. The wind howled as Elliot closed the door behind him, standing for a long while in the snow-covered doorway. The polar bear had already disappeared into the thickening storm, its white form blending with the swirling snowflakes as it moved silently into the vast cold world. Elliot's hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. He knew the bear would be all right. It was strong now, healed, and ready to return to the wild, to the world where it truly belonged. But the loneliness that had quietly crept back into his chest made his heart ache in ways it had not known for many years. He stood there watching the storm outside, waiting for a sign that the polar bear would turn back. But the wind gave no answers. It only carried the faintest traces of the bear's scent, now fading into the distance. The days that followed were quieter than ever before. The fire in the cabin crackled and popped, but the warmth felt colder now that there was no companion to share it with. Elliot sat by the hearth each evening, the rocking chair creaking beneath him, his hands resting in his lap as he stared into the flames. His eyes were tired, but there was something else in his gaze, a quiet peace, a solemn understanding of the choice he had made. The polar bear had come into his life when he least expected it, an animal in need of help, just as Elliot had once needed something he hadn't even known he was missing. In saving the bear, he had found a connection that transcended words, a bond that didn't need to be spoken to be felt. And though that bond had ended, the love that had formed between them would never leave him. Elliot thought back to the days they had spent together, the moments by the fire, the way the bear had rested its head on his lap, the silent trust that had blossomed between them. He smiled faintly, remembering the way the bear had looked at him with gratitude in those first moments of recovery, how it had slowly come to understand that it was safe, that Elliot would not leave it. He had given the bear his care, his compassion, and in return the bear had given him something just as precious, a reminder that love was not a limited resource. It was something that flowed, something that could be shared even between the most unlikely of companions. Though the bear was gone, Elliot knew that he had made a difference in its life, and in doing so, he had also found peace in his own heart. The love he had given freely, without asking for anything in return, had healed not just the bear, but himself. One evening, as Elliot sat by the fire, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. It was a faint glow from the window, just a shimmer in the night, far out on the horizon. Elliot's heart caught in his chest. He stood up, making his way to the window, and for a long while he stared out at the vast, snowy landscape. There in the distance, he saw the faintest trace of movement, something white moving against the backdrop of the snow. He squinted, his eyes narrowing in the dark, and the glow of the fire seemed to fade as he watched the figure grow closer. His breath caught in his throat. It was the polar bear. Elliot's heart pounded as he watched the creature, its large, majestic form moving slowly through the snow. The bear's fur shone faintly in the moonlight, and as it drew closer to the cabin, it paused. The two of them locked eyes, Elliot and the polar bear, across the distance that separated them. The bear stood there, its eyes soft, its massive form seemingly at ease. It let out a low, soft grunt, and for a moment it seemed to acknowledge Elliot's presence, the bond that had been forged between them, even if only for a brief time. Elliot's heart swelled with emotion, a mixture of sadness and joy. He had let the bear go, and in doing so, he had freed both of them. The polar bear had returned to the wild, to the place it belonged, and Elliot had finally found the peace he had been searching for. With one last look, the bear turned away, its form disappearing into the night. Elliot didn't call out or try to stop it. He simply stood there watching, his hands resting on the windowsill, the warmth of the cabin still around him but no longer holding him captive. The polar bear had found its way home, just as Elliot had found his peace. And in the quiet of the night, with the snow falling gently outside, Elliot knew that the bond they had shared would stay with him forever. It wasn't about keeping the bear. It was about letting it go, knowing that true love was not about possession, but about setting the ones you care for free. As the polar bear disappeared into the wilderness, Elliot closed the door softly, a faint smile on his lips. The fire crackled behind him, and for the first time in many years, he felt at peace with the silence. He had let go, and in doing so, he had found something greater than companionship. He had found the true meaning of love.